Good afternoon, good morning for those joining us and watching the recorded session. We are just going to wait for those to join the live session with us and begin shortly. Hope everyone's having a good day. Thanks for joining us. Okay, just a few more moments and we can start. Just give people some time. Okay. We're ready to go? Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to those watching the live, watching the replay. So today's the latest in SEN Talk speaker series called SEN Explained. We form partnerships with professionals, with lay people, and everyone in between to discuss special educational needs and neurodiversity. We believe that fostering dialogue is the key to developing more understanding and more empathy across differences. My name is Valenza, and if you're not familiar with our work at SEN Talk, we're a nonprofit organization based in South London with a mission to improve social and emotional outcomes and promote inclusion for children and young people with SEN and their families. So today I'm delighted to have Stephanie Camilleri with us, who will lead a presentation on ADHD Truth and Fiction, Dispelling Myths. So following her presentation, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer. So feel free to type questions at any point using the chat box to the right of your screen. We kindly ask if you limit your engagement to one question, so everyone, more than one person has the opportunity to engage and participate. The recording of today's live session will be available to rewatch on our YouTube page. An event attendees can expect to be sent this link, as well as any additional resources such as slides. So I'd now like to introduce Stephanie. She was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult following the diagnosis of her two daughters. A former Magic Circle lawyer working in banking, Stephanie is the founder of the ADHD Advocate and the co-founder of the ADHD Unlocked membership community. She's helped educate and inspire students and their parents, professionals, entrepreneurs, and creatives to help understand and embrace their ADHD, helping them to create the structures and strategies they need to achieve their goals. Stephanie is also a former primary school governor for special educational needs and disabilities, former chair of trustees of ADHD Action, and runs the London ADHD Support Group on Facebook. Stephanie is passionate about raising awareness of ADHD, particularly in education and healthcare. So now I'd like to pass it over to you, Stephanie. Thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Valenza, for having us here again to talk about ADHD. And today we are going to be talking about ADHD truth and fiction to dispel the many myths that currently prevail around ADHD and lead to many ADHDers not getting diagnosed and treated for their ADHD, which we will see leads to some pretty sometimes devastating consequences. So that's why it's really, really important that we're aware of what the myths are, and that also trying to equip you as parents to be able to advocate for your child. Unfortunately, you will need to probably dispel a lot of the myths that your school, the child's school will have in their heads. Even unfortunately, when it comes to diagnosis, sometimes clinicians don't really understand all the nuances of ADHD, particularly in girls. And so the more you understand ADHD, the myths that prevail, more importantly, being able to dispel them, then the more likely you're going to be able to get the help that your child with ADHD needs to thrive with the ADHD. So that's what we're going to try to do today. Now, there are a lot of myths. I just tried to choose the top kind of 10, and we're going to go through those. But firstly, just wanted to really highlight what's at stake here, okay? Because it's really important to know why we're talking about this, why this is so important. So this first slide, ADHD, it's a neurobiological condition. We're talking about a brain wiring, not a kind of mental health condition, behavioral disorder. You'll probably see, even as recently, I think, as last year, maybe in some other NHS trusts, the way that they describe ADHD, sometimes they still refer to behavioral disorder or mental health condition, whereas in fact, it is a neurobiological condition. This is a brain wiring, similar to autism, for instance. And unfortunately, there's a massive stigma still around ADHD. It's very much misunderstood and underdiagnosed. Now, that's one of the myths we're going to be looking at today, is that ADHD is overdiagnosed. You know, any problems that you have with your child, just bang the label of ADHD on it, and that's what's happening. Give them drugs, and there is that very much that kind of sense of shame that's being put on parents of children with ADHD in particular, to not readily diagnose and have their child treated for ADHD. Now, obviously, if the child doesn't have ADHD, then yes, you don't want to be just willy-nilly putting that label on them and administering medication. But the thing is, the diagnosis process, it's generally pretty robust, very comprehensive. And as you will see, as we talk about the diagnosis process, you've got to kind of get ADHD's got to be prevalent in at least 2 settings. So even if you as the parent think it's your child is displaying these traits, the thing is, and what you'll see quite often, the school, particularly if you've got a child, a girl with ADHD, won't agree with you. They won't see the same things that you're seeing at home. And actually, that's one of the problems in terms of girls with ADHD not being diagnosed and treated, because girls are very good at masking. A lot of them, the worst possible thing for girls with ADHD is to be kind of singled out and embarrassed or made to feel different. So girls in particular become very good at masking, but this comes at a very big cost, particularly later on. And that's why it's so important to intervene early, which we will get into. Okay, next slide. So in terms of what's at stake, these are just some statistics in relation to children. We know that there's a real issue in relation to sleep. And in fact, some people that have trouble with sleep, sometimes it can lead to what looks like ADHD traits, but it's not. But again, you know, the psychiatrist, whoever's diagnosing, will look at all the kind of history and look at different settings. So yeah, just wanted to highlight that though. But sleep is a major issue for children and adults with ADHD, in terms of getting off to sleep, in terms of waking up in the morning, some of them. And obviously, this is just going to exacerbate ADHD traits of inability to focus when needed to, and also mood regulation. So also, children with ADHD, 1.8 times more likely to experience physical injury each year. Now, this is due to a lot of the distractibility component of ADHD, and actually you'll see quite a few comorbidities or different like co-current conditions like dyspraxia, for instance, that sometimes travels with ADHD, and that is also going to affect the child's ability to navigate themselves around objects. For instance, when I was a child, I walked into everything. I walked into absolutely everything. I was littered in bruises and did not know where they came from, but it's just because I wasn't paying attention. I was very much in my head and not noticing what's around me. And you'll see that quite a lot with people with ADHD, particularly the forgetful fairy types I talk about. Now, this is also a very sobering statistic. 68% of girls with ADHD are pregnant before the age of 19, if not on stimulant medication. Unfortunately, this is a very real, very worrying consequence of girls with ADHD not getting the treatment that they need, is that because of the reward dopamine pathway impairments, a lot of ADHD is that we don't feel kind of reward like neurotypicals do. things aren't enough. We need more. We need more. And it's that kind of thrill. The dopamine hits are very compelling. And you can imagine you add the hormones to the ADHD, and the traits of impulsivity and the now versus not now phenomenon, not thinking about consequences, very much in the moment. Some ADHD is also very physical. There's a lot of kind of sensory things that go with ADHD, and if they're a sensory seeker, then you put all that together, and unfortunately, a lot of girls do fall pregnant underage. So, but if not on stimulant medication, which we will talk about medication a bit later. But these have consequences for the rest of their lives, obviously. Just to give you a bit of an indicator of how serious this is when ADHD is not diagnosed and treated. Now, for adults, there's so many implications. I've just gone with a few here, but I see this all the time in coaching. When we coach adults with ADHD, a lot of the issues that they have are in the workplace. A lot of them struggle to stay in work, and there's a lot of reasons for that we can talk about maybe another time. But 2/3 are more likely to have been fired from jobs, and two to four times more likely to have traffic accidents. So driving and ADHD, unfortunately, is a bit of a thing. Again, you add the impulsivity, the kind of forgetfulness, weak working memory. It can kind of be a recipe for a bit of driving accidents and speeding fines. ADHD is that reward dopamine pathway, seeking stimulation, going a little bit too fast, lots of tickets, right? They're twice as likely to separate or divorce. And so this is a very, very real, very crippling consequence of obviously having ADHD. And there's a whole, we in ADHD Unlocked, we've done like a whole kind of weeks on relationships with ADHD. So if you are interested in finding out more about the implications of ADHD in relationships, come and check out ADHD Unlocked, which I'll talk about at the end. And other statistics, we tend to under-earn at high school and college. A lot of us tend to not be able to continue with higher education because perhaps at school, for reasons of maybe not being authentically interested in the subject matter, or maybe having teachers that don't believe in you. ADHDers, because of their rejection sensitivity, tend to then just give up on the whole thing. We make really strong associations, ADHDers, and it takes one teacher that is unfair, doesn't believe in us, to completely make that subject a complete write-off, and the whole school experience sometimes as well. ADHDers can often fall into the wrong crowds as well because they're often feeling misunderstood. They themselves don't understand their ADHD, so they keep on maybe getting into trouble for talking, interrupting, maybe in their social relationships as well. A lot of them get bullied, and so they tend to then maybe stick to people that are also struggling and also kind of looking for dopamine hits, and it just kind of spirals. So a lot of ADHDers do unfortunately get excluded from school. And those that do stay in school, and maybe the structure of school has been able to hold them to do the work, but then when they start university, when the structure's gone and they're left to their own devices to look after themselves and actually go to lectures, you just see it all kind of fall apart, unfortunately. So there's the dropout rate for university students with ADHD is very high. And we actually coach quite a few university students to stay on course because they need that accountability. Too much choice. You give an ADHD too much choice, they tend to take the wrong ones, unfortunately. We've got to get out of our own way. So these are even higher stakes. And I know these are very sobering. But again, just really want to drive home the importance of why it's so important to understand ADHD and dispel the myths around it, so that if your child has ADHD, they can get diagnosed and treated. There is a very high increased risk of suicide. There really is. Those with ADHD are twice as likely to die prematurely. They're twice as likely, most commonly due to accidents, right? And we talked about the driving incidents, but also ADHDers are very addictive. They've got addictive personalities. So they're 2 to 4 times more likely to have addictions to alcohol, cigarettes, drugs, eating. A lot of ADHDers, the eating disorders are rife with ADHDers, gambling, video games, sex, porn. Again, it's that reward dopamine pathway that being impaired and needing more to feel that kind of reward, which isn't very lasting anyway. And that's why there's that kind of need, that addiction, and increasing the stakes just to kind of get that feeling of reward or even kind of interest. An ADHD individual is twice as likely to be a criminal. Now, this information was taken from the ADHD Coaching Academy information that was provided to us when we trained as coaches. So it's got all the research. These are all based on actual research studies, and they've got all the references. So if anyone wants the actual, the footnotes, where this comes from, we can share some of those studies. But I think a third of the prison population in the UK has got ADHD. That's 1/3, right? That is a lot. That's very high, and there's a reason for that. Again, ADHD is, falling into the wrong crowds. ADHD is, maybe overly speeding or that impulsivity and doing something that they regret later, but in the moment didn't really think about. So there are some really dire consequences of not getting assistance, getting support for your ADHD. The prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder is more than 6 times higher amongst adults diagnosed with ADHD. Because the thing is, and this is one of the myths which we'll cover about ADHD being a childhood disorder, it keeps going. You don't just grow out of your ADHD, right? It's there. What happens though, ADHD is situationally variable. So your situation changes as you get older. You have more control over your situation as you get older. And that is probably the biggest point here, is that in education, these children, they don't have a choice. They have to learn in a certain way, learn subjects that they're not interested in, that have no relevance to them. They can't change their situation. They're helpless to change the situation. And that's why they struggle in education in particular. But what tends to happen though, when they finish school, you'll find a lot of kids with ADHD that didn't do well at school. Once they leave school, some of them are very, very successful. So they may not have been academic and perform that way, but then they find their niche. They find what it is that they're naturally good at. And a lot of the time it is their own business, some kind of entrepreneurial type thing. And then they thrive because they can design their working environment around their ADHD and focus on those things that they're naturally good at. So it is very situational. So the more they understand their ADHD, their strengths and their challenges, then the more likely they're able to thrive with ADHD, as they get older. Okay. So these are the myths that we're going to cover. And I'm just going to close this window. I'm not sure if it's noisy, but it's distracting me. One sec. Okay. So we've got 10 myths here that we're going to cover. I won't go into all of them because we'll go into each of them separately. But these are the common ones, and it would be interesting to know, and please do share in the chat if any of these particularly resonate with you, or you've received these, or one of these could be the reasons why you're resisting seeking a diagnosis for your child. Just share in the chat. Feel free to do that. Myth 1, ADHD is made up. Yes. As we were talking about before, no, it's not made up. It is a neurobiological condition. It's not just some behavioral condition, mental health issue. It is a brain wiring. It's similar to the ASD. In fact, a lot of the genes apparently that are responsible for ASD also kind of contribute to ADHD. They share the same genes. Now, research on the genetic heritability of ADHD and the genes that are responsible, it's all ongoing. It is very much in the early days, but this is a real condition, right? And it's genetic, it's highly heritable, apparently just as much as height, which is very interesting. Now, my business partner in ADHD Unlocked, Michelle Beckett, did a presentation in ADHD Unlocked on this subject, and that's been recorded as well. So do feel free to join Unlocked and have a look at her presentation. But I've taken a lot of what she did in her presentation and I've brought into here as well, so that you can benefit here as well from from Michelle's expertise. She's a lot more scientifically based than I am, so she loves this type of thing. Research studies show numerous differences between those with and without ADHD. And again, we've got all the references, resources, research kind of papers if you want to get a list of those. And then the brain scan studies actually showed differences in the development of the brain of individuals with ADHD. So cortical thinning in the frontal regions, reduced volume, reduced gray matter, like you can actually see in these scans. Now, unfortunately, these scans aren't routinely offered for ADHD assessments. You don't really get these as part of the assessment, but it can be these assessments, these type of assessments can be purchased. I think they're more popular in America at the moment, but it's difficult, like any kind of condition like autism, things like dyslexia. It's not like a broken arm. It's not like cancer. It's not like, you can do a blood test and you can go, here, presto, I've got ADHD. It's a little bit more complex. It's a bit more, again, very nuanced. And ADHD doesn't travel alone anyway. It often comes with your autism and your dyslexia and your sensory integration issues. So it's not easy to pick apart, and often is a process of elimination. So this is where it does get difficult when you're trying to explain to other people that it is actually a real, neurobiological condition. It is in the DSM-5, which is what the psychiatrists use when they diagnose someone with these conditions. Autism's there, oppositional defiance disorder, narcissism, all kinds of these psychiatric conditions are in the DSM-5, and so is ADHD. And again, we can provide you with the criteria that clinicians are compelled to consult with when they make a diagnosis. And I think we've covered previously in the SEN talk, I think we've covered the diagnosis criteria before. So do have a look at that webinar, probably on YouTube, SEN talk as well. I think that was last year. Yeah, I think it was last year, 2021. Okay, so ADHD is very real condition. ADHD is a childhood disorder, so that's the second myth. Now, we have touched upon this already. It is a lifespan disorder, so recent research has shown that it does persist. Now, it can be reduced, certain traits that you have in childhood, like, for instance, I, as a child, was extremely impulsive. I've got combined type ADHD, so that's hyperactivity, impulsivity, and the inattention or distractibility. And definitely as a child, I was a lot more impulsive, physically, outwardly. And I think in year 5, I had a friend, and I just thought it'd be funny to pull a joke and pull the chair out from under her, and she fractured her tailbone. I did not mean, obviously, to hurt her. I just thought it would be a funny joke, but turned out not to be very funny. And I mean, there's no way in hell I would do anything like that again. But obviously, as a child as well, your brain's developing. I think they say that when you've got ADHD, you're like 3 or 4 years developmentally kind of behind in terms of maturity anyway. So really, I was like a year 2 person in year 5, I guess. So maybe that explains it. But it does change. I'm definitely not as impulsive as I was back then. As you get older, and physical hyperactivity tends to reduce, but we tend to swap it out for cognitive hyperactivity. So a lot of us that were physically hyperactive, some of us kind of become more workaholic type, just anything to keep the brain busy, to keep that interest flowing. So some of the statistics are here just to prove that ADHD does persist from childhood to adolescence. The early kind of research was saying, 50 to 80% of cases, but more recent research has shown that, it is a lifespan disorder. And particularly for girls aged 6 to 12 with childhood ADHD, they found that 10 years later, they continued to have higher rates of ADHD and coexisting conditions, including higher rates of suicide attempt and self-injury, compared to girls without ADHD. So particularly if you're a parent of a girl that you suspect that has ADHD, this is very important that you understand the nuances and why, in particular, girls with ADHD don't get diagnosed. And unfortunately, the DSM-5 criteria isn't very helpful because it is very much based on the kind of naughty boy traditional view of ADHD. But that is changing. There is more and more awareness. Awareness is growing, and hoping that the DSM-5, that the next round will be a little bit more reflective of girls and also adults with ADHD, right? But we've got to work with what we've got to work with. And there's a lot we can still do to inform clinicians that are very much single-mindedly just referring to the diagnostic criteria alone. Okay. Myth 3, ADHD is overdiagnosed. Again, it is hard not to believe this one with all the media and America and everyone talking about the pharmaceutical companies just trying to make a buck. But, you know, in the UK, 90% of adults who should have ADHD diagnosed statistically do not. So 90%, right? That is huge. So only 10% of that number are actually getting help. 10%, right? So in terms of that other 90% out there, that's huge, right? That's huge. And like what we talked about before, those consequences, they are surely suffering because they haven't, one, they may not be aware of their ADHD. They don't know about the myths, right? They haven't been able to dispel the myths or educate the clinicians. And so, yeah, they don't get the help that they need that could make all the difference to their life. And I can talk about this personally, obviously professionally. I coach a lot of kids, a lot of adults with ADHD, some people that are recently diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, but some adults that were diagnosed as a kid. And I find that really interesting to coach those that were diagnosed very early on, but then didn't actually get any treatment and support, didn't really understand the ADHD, but then saw all these things happening in adulthood. And then they realized, I really need help. I really should have taken this more seriously earlier, right? Because one thing to get diagnosed with ADHD, is another thing to actually get treatment for your ADHD, right? That's the second part of it that so often, unfortunately, gets overlooked. Because it's not just the medication, it's things like CBT, ADHD informed kind of therapy, but coaching as well. ADHD coaching is hugely beneficial, and training, you know, in your workplace or your school. Really important that everyone can see through that ADHD lens. Yeah, but children in England, especially girls, are being undertreated. They're not being over medicated for ADHD, and these figures were given by The Guardian actually fairly recently. So yeah, I was going to say, kind of put that in your pipe and smoke it. In terms of all the people with it, you know, that don't believe in ADHD, and just, you know, and it's sometimes not helpful when you talk to family members or friends about your concerns about your child with ADHD, when you hear things like, oh, but, you know, they're just a kid with, you know, or they're a boy, that's what boys do, or very quickly, or we're all like that in the family. We get that one a lot. What do you mean? We all do that. And it's like, yeah, guys, because ADHD runs in families and we all have it, but they don't know it. You don't know it, right? So understanding the ADHD, being able to look through the ADHD lens is crucial. And we do very much do that in ADHD Unlocked. We educate. Coaching is a bit different. We don't tend to educate. It's a bit more specific in relation to the person's situation and what they're trying to achieve. But ADHD Unlocked, amazing source of education, and you'll very much be able to get that ADHD lens through that community. So yeah, it is underdiagnosed and undertreated. Myth 4, poor parenting causes ADHD. This is a terrible one. Now, the problem is, I'm not sure if anyone can relate to this, but when you go into a school, if you've got a child with ADHD and you yourself have ADHD, but you don't know it and you're not getting help for it, you tend to get these disapproving looks from school teachers when you're talking about your child with ADHD, particularly if you turn up late to the appointment, or you forget the appointment and don't turn up at all and they're looking for you. And so they're so quickly able to assume that, oh my gosh, well, if you had a parent like that, of course, you know, your kid would be, you know, unable to organize themselves or have mood swings, or no wonder this poor child with a parent like that. And that upsets me massively, massively, because these parents with ADHD that don't know they've got ADHD, a lot of them, hopefully most of them, they're doing everything that they can to be there for their child. It's not a matter of won't, it's a matter of can't, because they don't realize that their ADHD causes these executive function difficulties. It's hard enough just trying to manage their own time, get themselves to work on time, remember things for themselves, let alone a child or children with ADHD in the mix. So that extra kind of chaos and extra memory load, decision fatigue, overwhelm. It's really a hugely difficult gig to be a parent with ADHD, parenting children with ADHD when you don't understand ADHD. It is, and I can tell you from personal and professional experience, that it is a disaster. In fact, when I went through it and I didn't understand, I didn't know anything about ADHD, didn't know I had it, or my husband or my children. And it was a toxic environment at home. You know, the neurotypical ways of dealing with kids just didn't work for my kids. And then, so your story that you're telling yourself as a parent, it just becomes, it just spirals. And unfortunately, it's self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, particularly if you are talking to the school and the school is very disapproving of you. It doesn't help. And there needs to be an understanding and compassion, and there needs to be accommodations made as well to help you if you have ADHD, so that you can then support your child. So the more you understand ADHD, the more you get your own support for your ADHD as a parent. I can tell you firsthand, the better able you are going to support your child. Because again, I have been there personally. I know what it's like to have ADHD and not know it, and try and parent my children with ADHD that I didn't know had ADHD. And it's hell. So do really try and understand as much as you can about it. And if you do suspect there is ADHD, get assessed and be open to treatment, because it makes all the difference. Okay. Myth 5, ADHD affects males more than females. So ADHD in girls and women, it's been recognized only in the past few decades, right? But they're at risk for many of the same coexisting conditions and those consequences that we talked about that males are. Now, again, because it was very much seen as more of a naughty boy kind of condition, a lot of the criteria that psychiatrists use is based on that profile. And now, obviously, we know that pretty much girls have got the same propensity towards having ADHD. It's genetic, it's inherited. And so it's pretty much the same. It's just that girls tend to be a little bit more masking about it. And they tend to, most of them are more the inattentive type only, as opposed to the hyperactive impulsive type. I happen to hit the jackpot, the trifecta, as did my eldest daughter as well. But a lot of, most from what the research shows, a lot of them are inattentive, or they're very good at masking, because the rejection sensitive dysphoria that they would feel from getting into trouble, they're so scared of getting into trouble or being an outsider, that pain that comes with the RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria, it compels them and keeps them interested enough to mask, to not blurt out that answer, right? To not say that thing, because the risk, what's at stake, is so high for them that they can actually manage that need to overshare or interrupt or do that thing, because they're so scared of the consequences. Which, unfortunately, I mean, it's great that they're not getting into trouble at school, but I bet you guys are copying it when they get home, because what you'll tend to see, child will try really hard at school and they'll get triggered, and friends will say stuff that'll make them feel terrible, and they'll get really hurt and they'll be really angry, but they're going to try really hard not to show that at school and to their friends. But then they'll come home, and then it all comes out. And then it's hard. You go to these parent-teacher meetings, and the teachers are talking about how amazing and how polite and helpful the child is, and they don't see anything, any issues. They don't see any mood regulation issues. Whereas literally you could be at home walking on eggshells with that child. And it's very difficult to be able to explain and convince others, particularly clinicians who are relying on school observations, otherwise. And I actually had that myself, but it was lucky enough with my youngest daughter that the psychiatrist, I think, spent about 2-3 hours with her, and the clinician's office could be taken as that second setting. So regardless of what the school said, right, because unfortunately the school did not understand inattentive ADHD very well in girls, but the psychiatrist did. And so we got that diagnosis and we got her treatment. And I thank God we did, because she was not doing well, and her esteem was shot, and she wasn't able to concentrate and learn anything in class, and she was angry, really angry, and a lot of that anger was directed towards herself. And this is what we see with girls with ADHD that don't get it, because they do things that other, maybe they say something that comes out really quite rudely or offensively, or because they're so upset they might hurt someone. And then the narrative is that this person, that the girl is like nasty or a bitch, and the thing is, they didn't intend to. They don't want to be that person. In fact, a lot of these girls are incredibly kind, and so they hate themselves. Yeah. And so this is why it's so important that if you've got a girl with ADHD and you suspect that she might have ADHD, get her assessed by someone that gets it, that understands ADHD in girls, and do have a look at maybe a different setting to the school if the school doesn't get it, which unfortunately a lot of them don't. So it is a bit of a minefield. It is not easy, but it's so worth it, I can tell you, because all those consequences that we covered before, right? It's like sliding doors. You could go that way or we could go this way. Let's not go that way. Okay, we don't have to. So we've got choice. We can do something about this now, and yeah, that's what we're here to do. So, do any questions you've got or any kind of recommendations that you want signposting to psychiatrists, let us know. So, myth 6: medication turns kids into zombies. This is a very, very big myth. Now, ADHD medication, it is seriously a life changer for some ADHDers. In about 80% of cases, it is highly effective. And again, I know this personally and professionally. I've seen it, I've experienced it personally myself, being on ADHD medication. I remember the first time I took it, I was able to actually see things. I stopped accidentally brushing my toothbrush into my gum because my head was somewhere else. I stopped walking into tables. I wasn't dead on my feet at the end of the day, not being able to look at anyone or talk to anyone because I'd used every bit of energy I had just to get through the day and listen, remember what someone had told me. And I didn't feel, I didn't feel so stressed trying to get the girls ready and on time and running to the school. You just feel so much calmer, because one thing that people don't know about the ADHD medication, a lot of people don't realize, is that it's the impact on mood and that anxiety, because anxiety comes with ADHD. And if the anxiety is secondary to the ADHD, what usually happens is if you treat the ADHD, that secondary anxiety is much more reduced, sometimes just ceases to exist, and life becomes so much more manageable. You don't have to deal with that, right? So it's a life changer, ADHD medication. Now, not everyone, unfortunately, gets the benefit of ADHD medication. Sometimes it can take, like for instance, my eldest daughter, it took us 1 whole year to get her on the right medication. Now I know that might sound, this poor kid having to try these different medications, these different side effects. I agree. I hated the fact that, some of the medications, she did become not a zombie, but she became more anxious sometimes on some of the medications. I could see that it meant that she didn't really want to go. Like, there was one time we went to a fairground and the medication made her too sensitive. And so she didn't want to go on the rides. And yeah, you don't want that at all. But over time, We got the right medication, the right dose. We learned she actually had autism as well as the ADHD, for which you cannot medicate. So we were able to then, get different treatment for the autism as well, but got her on the right ADHD medication. And you should see her. Like, she is amazing. She's thriving at school. Her academics have picked up like over the last couple of years. Like, yeah, she's a pretty high performer, diligent, confident, a massively confident learner. And she herself told me, it was age 11, she thanked me for putting her on medication. She said that without it, there's no way she could have learned. So it completely empowered her, right? Obviously, she also had a coach living with her that could give her the ADHD lens and champion her. But so it's the combination, obviously, of all of that. But the medication, truly, truly life-changing for some people. Okay. Now, again, yeah, there can be some side effects. But so long as you've got a good psychiatrist and you're doing those regular checkups, check-ins, you're logging maybe how the medication is affecting the child, right? And you're maybe like choosing the right times to try the medication, like holidays, for instance, when you're home and you can monitor it yourself and not just kind of send them off to school and cross your fingers and hope that they'll be okay, right? And that's probably what you see in terms of the zombies in class type thing. You want to be able to see for yourself the effect it's having if you can. But again, the stimulants, they don't stay in the system. It passes, then they're fine again, and you can just adjust your type. It's called the titration process. And I have to say, even though it took me 1 year to get Eva on the right medication, I would do it again without hesitation because of the way she is now. Yeah, so that's just my personal experience, and professionally, I see it all the time as well in coaching people that get diagnosed and medicated. Myth 7, we are all a bit ADHD. Yeah, I don't like this one either. When people say this too, well, of course, I get bored. My mind can wander. You've got all of those type of comments. Now, the thing with ADHD, it's the intensity and frequency of the ADHD traits in terms of that hyperactivity, impulsivity, and distractibility. It's that frequency, the severity that makes it impairing. In order to be assessed with ADHD, it's got to be impairing. It's got to impair, I think it's at least 2 areas of your life, and in at least there's 2 different settings. Again, don't quote me on that. We'll look at the DSM-5. But there's got to be some kind of detrimental impact, either socially, emotionally, academically, just functionally. There's got to be that difficulty that impacts, that adverse kind of consequence, right? So no, we're not all a bit ADHD. If you've got ADHD, it means there is a negative, there's an adverse impact as a result of the ADHD traits, okay? And here, this is a good little infographic. Yeah, everyone can be forgetful, but the vast majority of people don't have ADHD. Now, with the advent, particularly in the pandemic, with the advent of all the phones, and everyone, all these our young people just being completely switched into these electronic communications, video games, and the attention span, I think, just of young people generally, even without ADHD, right, has definitely decreased. They're not reading books voluntarily because there's a quick fix. So even if you don't have ADHD, right, as a kid growing up, you're going to go for the quick fix, that hit. And that does sometimes look like ADHD. I think Dr. Hallowell terms it VAST, V-A-S-T, variable attention stimulus trait. I think he calls it VAST. So it could be that potentially maybe the child doesn't have ADHD, but the environment has lent itself to these kind of, what looks like ADHD. But again, going through the diagnosis, the actual proper process, you should be able to verify whether it's just these VAST traits or whether it is actually ADHD. But certainly not helpful for our ADHDers that so easily, accessibly have this dopamine hit at their fingertips. Because again, guys, they're going to choose. They're going to make the wrong choice. You give us a choice, right? And we will self-sabotage. We'll make the choice, the wrong one in terms of, well, will this give me a dopamine hit now? Yes. Okay, I'll do that. So, you want to be able to modify environments and things to kind of encourage, or at least kind of force your child to make the right choice. It's the only choice, if that makes sense. It's very interesting. So yeah, forgetfulness, impulsivity. It's the frequency, the severity, the consequences as a result of the forgetfulness. Yeah, the intensity. So it's not, we're not all a bit ADHD at all, and no two people with ADHD are the same either. So it is very nuanced. This myth: you can't have ADHD if you have a degree, and I have a personal story on this. So when my eldest daughter, got diagnosed with ADHD, I pointed the finger at my husband, and after I was reading a little bit about ADHD, and I said, "That's you. It comes from you." And then later on, I realized maybe it was me too, because my 3-year-old at the time was kind of reminding me to put the buggy back in the car when I'd set off to go to ballet and leave the buggy on the pavement. Accidentally opened the fridge door and she's standing behind it. And you'd hear it, ouch, or just step back and there's a child, and all that kind of thing. So I was getting all this feedback from my pretty switched on 3-year-old at the time. And I realized, hang on, what's going on? Yeah, it was like a mirror was being held up to me. So I went and saw a psychiatrist who actually said to me, okay, yeah, sure, these things, that's true. But you're a lawyer. You're a lawyer. You went to university and studied law and became a lawyer and worked in a law firm. I'm not sure, you got ADHD? I remember thinking, yeah, all those things are true. I did study law. I worked well in the law firm. I got a bit confused by that because all these other things, were very much ADHD. And and what a lot of psychiatrists do, they try you on the medication to see, that's kind of like the final kind of test. Does the medication actually have a positive impact, and increase focus and decrease some of these impulsive behaviors and things like that. And yeah, for me, it was like night and day. I didn't realize how hard I was doing it before. Yeah, it's really quite phenomenal, even from just even sight of things. I could actually see corners. Yeah, and you've got an ability to pause and think before you do, which was something I didn't know how to do. That I was on autopilot all the time. So yeah, you can be extremely proficient at your job. In fact, a lot of ADHDers are at the top of their industries, right? Now, obviously not all ADHDers are really bright and have high IQs, but those that do, when you add that to ICNUP, Dr. Dodson's, formula for keeping the ADHD brain engaged, which is interest, challenge, novelty, urgency, and passion. You add that to the IQ, and then the rejection sensitive dysphoria. Because we are so rejection sensitive, we tend to be perfectionists. We want to do things above reproach. We need to be the best. And so you add all of those things together, you get some very high performing people. Maybe not in all areas of their life, because usually like workaholics, and that's why you see so many in medicine and law and banking in particular, because there's always something to engage your brain. Like you never run out of that fuel, which, as we know, can lead to burnout, because ADHD is Ferrari brains, bicycle brakes, not good brakes, not strong brakes. So it's a paradox of strengths, incredible strengths, but also incredible weaknesses. It's situationally variable. So again, the more we understand the ADHD, right, and we can start designing situations so that they play to our strengths, and we can mitigate against the weaknesses, or preferably eliminate them, outsource them, right? There are ways, and we do a lot of this in coaching actually, but you can most definitely have ADHD and have a degree and be top of your industry. A lot of managing directors have ADHD, but then maybe talk to their spouse and then see how well they're performing at home. Yeah. Okay, myth 9, ADHD means hyperactive and is visible. Now, only 15% of kids and 5% of adults with ADHD show physical signs of hyperactivity. Now, this again goes back to the old DSM-5 kind of criteria that doesn't really reflect the position for girls and women and adults in particular. A lot of our hyperactivity is cognitive need to stay stimulated. So you may see that your child can't just watch TV. It's too boring. They have to have their phone as well, right? Because they can't stand to kind of sit down and have to watch something that doesn't authentically interest them. You probably see as well, a lot of ADHDers, they actually kind of will put their phone down if it's a very gripping or horrific TV series, and the brain is actually got enough stimulation that they can just watch the TV, which I'm not that type. I can't stand horror. It freaks me out and I can't get it out of my head. But some ADHDs, it's exactly this just enough stimulation for them to actually watch the TV, because they need that level of stimulation, because the brain just is so thirsty. It's the fuel. But yeah, the hyperactive, impulsive, outward type is really not the majority type ADHD that you see, particularly as you grow up into adulthood. That kind of reduces and swaps out for more of that cognitive hyperactivity. Okay. The final myth: ADHDers can't pay attention. Although as a parent, you probably would accuse your child of, hang on, well, you've been playing that video game. You've had no problems concentrating on that video game for 2-3 hours, but yet you can't do your homework, or you can't help me with this chore, do that. We know ADHDers can pay attention to those things that they're authentically interested in. In fact, it's what we term the ADHD hyperfocus. The problem is not trying to get them to engage in those tasks. It's about trying to get them to transition off those tasks, because they're so engrossed in them. It's just completely feeding their brain that they just can't, the brain can't disengage from it. So it's about trying to redirect that attention to the thing that they're meant to be focusing on, which is very difficult, because ADHDers have an interest-based nervous system as opposed to an importance-based nervous system. So, you might think that them washing the dishes or cleaning their room is important, but for that ADHDer with that interest-based nervous system, just not enough interest there to fuel them to do that thing. So there are other ways around that, which is not the subject of our presentation today. We do a lot of this in coaching as well, but appeal to their interest. Yeah, immediate reward, as close in time as possible, and keep it relevant. There's got to be a point. If there's no point for an ADHDer, there's just no point. They're a smart bunch. So hopefully I've given you guys enough information to help you better understand ADHD, and that you're aware of the myths that prevail that contribute to the stigma that is causing so many ADHDers to not get the diagnosis and support that they need to work with their ADHD, to design their best life around their ADHD. So my hope is that you walk away from today armed with more knowledge and understanding, and with some of the language to use when faced with maybe a school teacher that doesn't get it, or even a clinician that doesn't quite understand it. And what's helpful is the NICE guidelines, which, Valenza, I think I can always send you a link to that to circulate to people, because that's something that all clinicians are meant to follow. It's guidance for the assessment of ADHD. So that can be very helpful to hand to your GP when they're doubting you and the ADHD diagnosis in general. So hopefully that has been helpful. And do come and, if you've got any questions, get in touch. That should be Stephanie at admin at thehdadvocate.com. I think Eleni did the last presentation. I didn't change that. But also ADHD Unlocked. I can put in the chat a link to joining that. It's only $29 a month, and it's an amazing resource and fantastic community. But yeah, any questions, just let Valenza know.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a wonderful overview. I'm happy now if those watching have questions. You can also receive those questions after the session if you'd like to let some of this information settle in. If not, maybe I'll give it a few minutes. If not, a few seconds. If not, we can close out the session. A few minutes, few seconds. Okay. I think no questions for now, but it's okay, Stephanie, if people pass questions along. Is that
Yeah, not a problem.
okay? Okay. Well, thank you for those who joined us today, and thank you so much, Stephanie, for such an informative presentation. Oh, we do have moments. Oh, we just have some feedback. All right. Oh, quick question from Mark. I'll give you a second, Mark. No problem. I don't want to rush anyone.
No.
Okay. Michelle has a question here. She says, I was wondering about coaching. What age would you suggest starting?
Right. So it very much depends on the child and what other conditions they've got, whether or not the ADHD is just inattentive type only, or they're hyperactive, impulsive as well. Because if they're not medicated, it can be very difficult for the child to be able to just to sit and engage in the coaching session. So what we do at Advocate, we always kind of do an intro call. Firstly with the parent, obviously, to find out what they're looking for, but then the child themselves, we make sure we have a little chat and do a little coach to see how receptive they are, how effective it is, and then we decide from there whether or not the child's coachable and will benefit. But definitely, we do a tell a new story session, a one-off session. So instead of like kind of a weekly coaching kind of program, for some of the kids that might not be kind of coachable regularly, the tell a new story session helps them. It's just one kind of session that helps them understand their ADHD and helps them reframe using a strengths-based approach, which is very effective actually. So we do have that option.
Very useful to get. Thank you. Okay. I know we have another typing and taking their time to type. So we'll just give them a few moments.
Yeah, I just put in the chat the link to ADHD Unlocked as well.
Great. Great. Okay, we have one question here. Clinton, is the one-to-one ADHD coaching something that could be funded by an EHCP, and what type of evidence would be required to convince the local authority to grant such funding?
Yeah, good. These are good questions. So with the ADHD coaching, it'd be best if you want to get that in your EHCP, then you'd want a recommendation from the psychiatrist that had diagnosed your child with ADHD. Now, we've got like about 12 referral psychiatrist partnerships. So but your child's psychiatrist might not be one of our partners. Now, again, I'm happy to have a chat to that psychiatrist. Maybe the psychiatrist doesn't really know much about ADHD coaching, and I love to kind of expand our network and make sure that psychiatrists know of this additional support that they can give their patients. So happy to, if you'd like to contact admin@thehdadvocate.com, let me know what your psychiatrist's name is, and if you're happy to, we can have a chat to them. And then if they kind of do a letter, right, and we've got lots of evidence around how effective the coaching is, and if they do a letter, then the council can take that recommendation and put that in the HCP.
Okay. We have another from Michelle. I have an 8-year-old who has a diagnosis, but he doesn't know. Do you have any useful resources for that? Now, I'm not sure what Michelle is referring to, but maybe starting off.
Yeah, no, of course. So I find now ADHD is particularly the kids, they don't like being told what to do, right? You want to ask, don't tell, and you want them to verbally process as much as possible. And so in our telling you story sessions, I find they're the most effective way of educating the child about their ADHD, because we take a coaching approach. So, we just kind of ask questions, and what really kind of engages them and opens them up is when they realize that, particularly because all our coaches have got ADHD, but we might kind of talk about something that we did or do, and they can see that, oh, hang on, it's not just me. As soon as they realize this is a thing, and that this person gets it, they open up, because it's that lack of understanding and people not understanding them that tends to shut them down, and not be open to talking about it. So just that normalization and understanding and in it together is really effective for educating the kids.
And I'm not sure if, Michelle, you are based in Southwest London, but we have a number of after-school specialist clubs where sort of ADHD is normalized. So I think that's a really good point there.
Definitely, yeah.
Let me see. So we have a question from Angelique. My son was taking medication for focus, but we stopped over the summer. It's been very hard since then. So we have reverted to starting them up again. Medication is not just for school. Let me just see what the question is here. I wonder if there's a question from Angelique about this. Or was that a comment? I'm not sure.
Yes, that sounds like a comment. No, medication's not just for school. I completely agree with you. I mean, again, no two kids with ADHD are the same. But yeah, like my eldest, for instance, she wasn't eligible for any kind of medication breaks because the danger to herself. Like, once we went on holidays and my husband and I kind of, we felt bad that she hadn't kind of taken a break from medication, and we thought, okay, let's, other kids that take breaks, let's give her a day. She literally nearly threw herself out of a window. Because she was she was kind of on a terrace thing, looking out, wanting to see the crowds outside. Yeah, no, medication for some, particularly the hyperactive and impulsive ADHDs, is not just for school. Definitely.
Yeah, that is something we see quite a lot with family support. Is okay, what do we do during half term breaks?
Oh God, even more so. If you take away the structure and accountability, like the ADHD gets worse. The mood goes down massively without the medication, in an unstructured environment with kind of no one to kind of please, none of that accountability. A lot of them fall into rumination. So actually it is, important that they get treated then.
Certainly. Okay, I think those are the last of the questions, unless someone wants to pop one in the chat now. Otherwise, we can close out. So I just want to say thank you for those that have joined. We're really excited that you joined us for this important conversation, this important dialogue. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for your time and energy on this subject.
No, you're welcome. And yeah, any questions, just reach out and we'll be happy to help you.
All right.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.